February 12th, 1943. The Royal Navy Admiralty, London. A directive landed on the desks of destroyer and corvette captains across the Atlantic convoy routes, and its message carried the weight of institutional embarrassment. Ships equipped with the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar were hereby ordered to file written reports explaining why they had not employed the weapon against underwater contacts. This was unprecedented. The Admiralty was not asking captains to justify failed attacks. They were demanding explanations for attacks that never happened. The weapon, mounted prominently on their foredecks, visible to every crew member who walked past, was being systematically ignored. Captains were choosing depth charges, the proven killer that had served since the First World War, over a device their superiors had spent 2 years developing and installing at considerable expense. The mathematics told a story of institutional crisis. By early 1943, the Hedgehog had been installed aboard more than 100 Royal Navy vessels, yet success rates hovered around 5%, barely better than the depth charge attacks that commanders knew by heart. The weapon that was supposed to revolutionize anti-submarine warfare had instead become a monument to skepticism, a steel reminder that good engineering alone cannot win wars. What none of these captains yet understood was that their distrust of the Hedgehog was about to transform into something far more powerful than mere acceptance. Within 18 months, this same weapon would achieve kill rates approaching 20%, would sink 47 U-boats in 268 attacks, and would enable one American destroyer escort to accomplish what military historians would later call the most devastating anti-submarine performance in naval history. The journey from institutional rejection to legendary effectiveness would reveal a truth that echoes across every technological revolution in military history. The weapon was never the problem. The problem was that nobody had taught them how to believe in it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The crisis that birthed the Hedgehog began not in laboratories or design offices, but in the freezing North Atlantic, where men died while hunting an enemy they could not see. The depth charge had served the Royal Navy since 1916, a cylindrical container filled with 300 pounds of high explosive, designed to detonate at preset depths. The concept was brutally simple. Roll the charge off the stern of your ship, or fire it sideways using a K-gun projector, and hope the explosion occurred close enough to a submarine to crush its pressure hull through hydrostatic shock. The problems were equally brutal. A destroyer hunting a U-boat would acquire target contact using ASDIC, the British sonar system that sent acoustic pulses through the water and listened for echoes bouncing off metal hulls. The technology worked remarkably well at distances beyond 800 yards. Operators could hear the distinctive ping of a submarine echo, could track its depth and bearing, could guide their ship toward the kill. But ASDIC had limitations that U-boat commanders learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness. As the destroyer closed to attack range, typically within 200 yards of the target, the sonar would lose contact entirely. The acoustic pulse and its returning echo merged into an instantaneous sound that human operators could not distinguish. This blind zone, this moment when the submarine vanished from detection, became known as the dead time, and it was during this dead time that German submarine captains performed the maneuvers that saved their lives. The experienced U-boat commander knew exactly when ASDIC contact would break. He could hear the destroyer's propellers accelerating overhead, could feel through his hull the characteristic surge that preceded a depth charge attack. At that moment, he would order emergency maneuvers. Hard rudder, change depth, perhaps blow a bubble decoy or release oil to create a false target. By the time the depth charges began detonating 30 seconds later, the submarine would be 300 feet away from where the destroyer thought it was. The statistics were grimmer than most civilians realized. In the first months of the war, only 5% of depth charge attacks resulted in a confirmed kill. Normal combat conditions reduced that figure to 3%. A single depth charge pattern, typically 6 to 10 charges dropped in a spread formation, had roughly a 3% probability of sinking a submarine. 5 separate attack runs might raise the chance of a kill to 10%, assuming the submarine remained in the area and the destroyer maintained fuel and ammunition to continue the hunt. U-boat 427 demonstrated the desperate futility of this mathematics. In April 1945, Allied destroyers hunted this submarine for hours, dropping charge after charge in a determined effort to force it to the surface or crush it through accumulated damage. The final count reached 678 depth charges expended against a single target. U-boat 427 survived every explosion and eventually escaped to fight again. 678 massive underwater detonations. 0 kills. The problem extended beyond mere accuracy. Depth charge explosions created turbulence and acoustic noise that rendered ASDIC useless for 15 to 20 minutes after each attack. The submarine crew, shaken but alive, could use this blind period to escape at maximum speed, while the destroyer waited for the ocean to calm enough for sonar to function again. Many U-boats survived specifically because the depth charge attack itself erased the destroyer's ability to track them. The explosive yield was part of the equation, but not the solution. Each depth charge carried tremendous destructive power. A close detonation could rupture hull plates, shatter gauges, break men's eardrums, and create terror that bordered on psychological collapse. But close was the operative word. The charge detonated at a preset depth, somewhere in the general vicinity of where the destroyer thought the submarine might be. Water acted as a cushion, dissipating the explosive shock rapidly with distance. A submarine 300 feet from the explosion might feel violent shaking. A submarine 800 feet away might not notice at all. By 1941, it had become clear to a small group of weapons developers at the Admiralty that this approach was fundamentally inadequate for the war Britain was fighting. German U-boat construction was accelerating. Admiral Karl Dönitz was perfecting wolfpack tactics that assembled multiple submarines to attack single convoys. The Battle of the Atlantic, as Churchill would later call it, was being lost. Britain's survival depended on merchant shipping crossing the Atlantic with food, fuel, weapons, and materials. Every successful U-boat attack brought the nation closer to starvation and defeat. The solution emerged from an unexpected source. A secret weapons development office with the bureaucratic title Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, nicknamed by insiders as the Wheezers and Dodgers for its collection of retired officers and civilian engineers deemed too old or too eccentric for conventional military service. This group had been tasked with developing specialized armaments for unconventional warfare, everything from limpet mines for saboteurs to unusual grenades for commandos. Among this collection of creative misfits worked Major Millis Jefferies, a specialist in explosive devices who had collaborated with Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker on an unusual weapon design. Blacker had developed something called a spigot mortar during the interwar years, a weapon based on old infantry trench mortars, but employing a unique firing mechanism. Rather than using a tube to contain and direct the explosion, the spigot mortar used a fixed rod, or spigot, mounted on a base plate. The bomb itself contained a hollow tail that fitted over this spigot. When fired, the propellant charge detonated between the bomb and the base plate, launching the projectile into the air. This design allowed a single launcher to fire bombs of different sizes and weights, a flexibility impossible with tube-based mortars. The British Army had already adopted the principle for the Blacker bombard and later for the PIAT anti-tank weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Blacker had approached the Admiralty before the war, suggesting the spigot principle might work for anti-submarine weapons. The Admiralty had dismissed him with the curt response that there was no naval requirement. By 1941, that assessment had changed dramatically. The Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development began secret research into forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons. They had already tested an unsuccessful design called the Fairley mortar aboard HMS Whitehall, which attempted to fire full-size depth charges ahead of a ship. The concept proved viable, but the execution was disastrous. The deck couldn't withstand the forces involved. The depth charges themselves were damaged by the violent launch, and the weapons had terrible aerodynamic properties that made accurate placement impossible. Blacker's spigot mortar principle offered a different approach. Instead of attempting to throw massive depth charges, what if they fired multiple small bombs in a pattern? Each bomb would be significantly smaller than a depth charge, perhaps 65 pounds total weight with a 35-pound explosive charge. But fired in a salvo of 24 projectiles, arranged in a circular pattern, the system would blanket an area with potential kill shots. The critical innovation came in the fusing mechanism. Depth charges used time or pressure fuses that detonated at preset depths, regardless of whether they hit anything. The new weapon would use contact fuses. The bombs would only explode if they physically struck something solid, like a submarine hull, miss completely, and the bombs would simply sink to the ocean floor without detonating. This solved multiple problems simultaneously. First, contact fuses meant that every explosion indicated a direct hit on the target. The sonar operators would know immediately whether their attack had succeeded. No more wondering if the massive underwater explosions had damaged the submarine or merely frightened its crew. Second, failed attacks would not disturb the water or create acoustic noise. The destroyer could maintain continuous sonar contact throughout repeated attack runs, adjusting aim based on the submarine's evasive maneuvers. Third, the weapon could be fired while the submarine was still in sonar contact before the blind zone made targeting impossible. The designers calculated the mathematics carefully. Each projectile would be 7.2 inches in diameter, weighing 65 pounds with a 35-pound charge of torpex, a powerful explosive mixture of 42% RDX, 40% TNT, and 18% powdered aluminum. The spigots would be angled, so the 24 projectiles would land in a circular pattern, approximately 100 to 30 feet in diameter, about 200 yards ahead of the ship's position. The bombs would then sink at roughly 23 feet per second. A submarine at 200 feet depth would be reached in under 9 seconds. The launcher itself required careful engineering to minimize stress on the ship's deck. 4 cradles, each holding 6 spigots, were arranged on a steel framework that could be rotated to compensate for the ship's roll. The firing sequence was staggered, launching the projectiles in pairs with the highest trajectories firing first. This ensured all 24 bombs would hit the water at approximately the same time despite following different arcs through the air. More importantly, the staggered firing minimized recoil stress on the mounting, meaning the weapon could be retrofitted to existing ships without major structural reinforcement. The design team built a prototype and installed it aboard HMS Westcott, a W-class destroyer, in 1941. The weapon looked peculiar, a forest of vertical spigots arranged in neat rows, resembling nothing so much as the spines on the back of a hedgehog. The name stuck. Officers began referring to it as the Hedgehog, and the informal designation became official. Initial tests were promising enough that production began in late 1942. By early 1943, more than 100 Royal Navy vessels had been equipped with Hedgehog mounts. The weapon had been demonstrated to Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself, who expressed enthusiasm for its potential. On paper, every aspect of the design made sense. The mathematics checked out, the engineering was sound, the tactical advantages were clear. The Hedgehog represented exactly the kind of innovation Britain needed to turn the tide in the Atlantic. The weapon failed anyway. Not mechanically. The Hedgehog functioned exactly as designed. The projectiles fired reliably. The spigots held up under repeated use. The contact fuses worked as intended. The failure was psychological, institutional, human. The crews did not trust it. The captains did not use it. And nobody could quite articulate why a weapon that made perfect sense on paper felt so wrong in practice. The problems began manifesting in ways that seemed minor but accumulated into institutional resistance. The Hedgehog sat mounted on the foredeck, exposed to North Atlantic weather that even hardened sailors found brutal. Spray from heavy seas would cover the launcher, seeping into electrical connections that controlled the firing circuits. When crews attempted to launch after hours of exposure to salt water and freezing temperatures, the system would malfunction, firing incomplete patterns or failing to launch at all. These mechanical hiccups, while fixable through better weatherproofing and maintenance procedures, created doubt in crews who needed absolute confidence in their weapons. The psychological impact of the weapon's silence proved more insidious than anyone anticipated. Depth charge attacks were loud, visceral, reassuring events. The charges rolled off the stern with satisfying mechanical clunks. The explosions arrived seconds later, massive underwater detonations that lifted stern plates and sent shock waves through the hull. Crew members could feel the power in their bones. Even when attacks missed, which they usually did, the explosions created a sense of having struck back at an invisible enemy. The sound and fury suggested effectiveness, even when effectiveness was absent. Hedgehog attacks were eerily quiet by comparison. The projectiles fired with modest pops, like mortars rather than artillery. They splashed into the water 200 yards ahead with barely audible impacts. Then, nothing. If the attack missed, which it usually did in those early months, there was simply silence. No massive explosions to suggest you had at least frightened the enemy. No shock waves to feel through the deck. Just quiet failure that left crews wondering if they had accomplished anything at all. The sonar operators reported strange phenomena that seemed to contradict the weapon's promised advantages. Yes, they maintained contact throughout the attack, as designed, but something about watching the submarine on sonar while firing the Hedgehog felt wrong to men trained in depth charge tactics. They were accustomed to losing contact, accelerating to attack speed, dropping charges blindly, then waiting to see what surfaced. The new approach required calm, methodical tracking, while projectiles flew overhead, then continued tracking to assess results and prepare follow-up attacks. The technique felt passive, detached, too much like mathematics and not enough like combat. Captains faced a different psychological barrier. Their training, their experience, their instincts all centered on depth charge tactics perfected through thousands of convoy escort missions. They knew how to conduct a depth charge attack. They understood the patterns, the spread calculations, the timing sequences. When sonar detected a U-boat, they knew exactly what to do, had done it dozens of times, could execute the maneuver while exhausted or terrified or under fire. Muscle memory and institutional knowledge guided their actions. The Hedgehog required different tactics, different approach angles, different decision points. Captains had to maintain slower speeds to keep sonar contact stable. They had to trust mathematical calculations for projectile spread rather than rely on practiced intuition about depth charge placement. Most critically, they had to accept that silence meant failure rather than uncertainty. A quiet Hedgehog attack was a confirmed miss. A noisy depth charge attack might have been a kill, might have been near miss, might have at least shaken the enemy's morale. The ambiguity was strangely comforting compared to the Hedgehog's brutal clarity. The result was predictable. Captains reverted to what they knew. When sonar contact was gained, they would make a token pass with the Hedgehog to satisfy their orders, then switch to depth charges for the actual attack. Some captains bypassed the Hedgehog entirely, reporting equipment malfunctions or unfavorable tactical conditions that made its use impractical. The weapon mounted prominently on their foredecks became decorative, a symbol of Admiralty intentions rather than an actual combat tool. By February 1943. The statistics were damning. Of the 100-plus ships equipped with Hedgehog, actual employment rates were dismally low. When the weapon was used, success rates barely exceeded 5%, roughly comparable to depth charge attacks, and nowhere near the 20 to 30% that engineering calculations suggested should be achievable. The Admiralty had invested significant resources into a weapons system that crews actively avoided using. The directive that landed on captains' desks that February carried both frustration and desperation. The phrasing was bureaucratically neutral, but the message was clear. Use the weapon, or explain why you are not using it. The Admiralty needed data, needed to understand whether the Hedgehog was fundamentally flawed or merely misunderstood. But beneath the request for information lay a deeper question that nobody quite knew how to ask. How do you make men trust a weapon that contradicts everything their experience tells them about combat? How do you overcome institutional momentum that favors the familiar over the innovative? How do you transform a good idea on paper into an effective tool in the hands of exhausted, terrified sailors fighting for their lives in the middle of the North Atlantic? The answer would come not from London, not from admirals or engineers or weapons designers. It would come from a shore base in Northern Ireland where convoy escorts gathered between missions, and from an officer who understood that the problem was never the technology. The problem was that nobody had taught the sailors how to believe in it. Londonderry, Northern Ireland. Spring 1943. The Royal Navy shore establishment, officially designated HMS Ferret, occupied the grounds of Ebrington Barracks on the banks of the River Foyle, just upstream from where it widened into Lough Foyle and then the open Atlantic. The location was strategic, chosen because Londonderry was the United Kingdom's most westerly port, providing the fastest access to convoy routes where U-boats hunted. By April 1943, HMS Ferret was responsible for 149 escort and anti-submarine patrol vessels, 2,000 shore-based personnel, and approximately 20,000 British and Canadian seamen who rotated through between convoy missions. These sailors spent weeks at sea hunting submarines in conditions that tested human endurance. They returned to Londonderry exhausted, traumatized, needing rest and repair before heading back into the Atlantic. The base provided maintenance facilities, fuel, ammunition, food, medical care, and something more valuable than any physical resource: time to train. Into this environment arrived an officer from the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, carrying with him a mission that seemed almost absurdly simple on its surface. He was going to teach sailors how to use the Hedgehog properly, not through written directives or technical manuals shipped from London, but through direct instruction, shipwide talks, demonstrations of successful attacks, analysis of what worked and what failed. He was going to treat the Hedgehog not as a piece of equipment that needed installing, but as a skill that required teaching. The exact identity of this officer has been lost to historical documentation, one of thousands of mid-level personnel whose names never appeared in official records, but whose work shaped outcomes. What remains is evidence of his methodology, preserved in the dramatic improvement in Hedgehog effectiveness that followed his arrival at Londonderry. He began not with technical specifications or engineering drawings, but with conversations. He went ship to ship, talking with captains, executive officers, sonar operators, gunners. He asked what they thought of the Hedgehog. He listened to their complaints, their doubts, their explanations for why they preferred depth charges. What he heard was revealing. The technical complaints, the malfunctioning firing circuits and weatherproofing issues, were symptoms rather than causes. The deeper problem was conceptual. Sailors had learned depth charge tactics through repetition and cultural transmission. Every destroyer captain had served under commanders who taught them the standard approach. Every sonar operator had watched experienced predecessors track submarines. The institutional knowledge was rich, deep, embedded in informal training that occurred during actual combat missions. The Hedgehog lacked this institutional foundation. It was new, unfamiliar, installed aboard ships without adequate training programs to support it. Crews were expected to read technical manuals and figure out proper employment through trial and error. But trial and error in anti-submarine warfare meant dead sailors and sunken merchants. When facing a real U-boat contact, captains reverted to tactics they knew would work adequately, rather than risk failure with techniques they had never properly practiced. The officer from DMWD began constructing what would now be called a comprehensive training program, but which at the time was simply practical instruction focused on changing minds. He gathered crews in ship messes and briefing rooms, standing before men who had every reason to be skeptical. He did not lecture them on engineering specifications or mathematical calculations. Instead, he told them stories about successful Hedgehog attacks. HMS Inconstant, operating in the North Atlantic in November 1942, had been the first British vessel to sink a U-boat with Hedgehog. The details mattered. The sonar operator had maintained steady contact despite the submarine's evasive maneuvers. The captain had approached at controlled speed rather than sprinting to attack. The Hedgehog salvo had been aimed not at where the submarine currently was, but at where it would be when the projectiles reached depth. Multiple detonations had been heard. Oil and debris had surfaced. A confirmed kill, recorded and verified. He explained the tactical sequence step by step, making explicit what successful crews had learned through intuition. Sonar contact at 1,500 yards. Reduce speed to 10 knots to maintain clean tracking. Calculate target depth and bearing. Account for submarine's course and speed. Aim the Hedgehog's spread to intercept the submarine's predicted position. Fire when range closed to 300 yards, while sonar contact remained solid. Listen for detonations. If silence, maintain contact and prepare immediate follow-up attack. The key insight was about treating the Hedgehog not as a replacement for depth charges, but as a precision instrument that required different handling. Depth charges were area weapons, designed to saturate a zone with explosive force. Missing by 200 feet might still achieve a kill through hydrostatic shock. The Hedgehog was a direct fire weapon that demanded accuracy, but rewarded precision with far higher probability of success. 1 or 2 projectiles hitting the submarine's pressure hull would accomplish what dozens of depth charges could not. He addressed the psychological barrier of silence directly, reframing it from weakness to advantage. Silence meant you could immediately fire again. Silence meant your sonar remained clear. Silence meant the submarine crew had no warning that you had missed, no opportunity to celebrate survival and execute emergency evasion. You could conduct attack after attack, methodically adjusting aim, forcing the submarine to burn battery power in continuous evasive maneuvers, eventually catching it when luck and geometry aligned. The officer brought mathematics but made it intuitive. A circular spread of 24 projectiles covered approximately 130 feet in diameter. A surfaced U-boat was about 220 feet long and 20 feet wide. A submerged submarine was functionally a cylinder, roughly those dimensions. If you place that circular spread centered on the submarine's calculated position, probability of at least one hit approached 40%. Poor aim reduced that dramatically. Good aim, accounting for the submarine's movement and depth, could approach 60% hit probability on first attack. He demonstrated proper maintenance procedures for the electrical firing circuits, showing crews how to weatherproof connections and check continuity before operations. He explained what incomplete salvos indicated, mechanical faults versus operational faults, which problems required repair and which simply needed different firing techniques. He made the weapon comprehensible, removed the mystique that surrounded unfamiliar equipment, transformed it from inscrutable device to understandable tool. Most importantly, he conducted practice exercises. Ships leaving Londonderry for patrol would now conduct Hedgehog drills using practice projectiles with concrete heads rather than explosives. The crews would practice the approach sequence, the sonar tracking, the firing procedure, the immediate post-attack assessment. They would fire dozens of practice salvos in safe water, learning how the weapon behaved, building muscle memory and procedural confidence. By the time they encountered actual U-boats, the Hedgehog was no longer unfamiliar. It was just another weapon in their arsenal, one they knew how to employ effectively. The results began appearing in action reports by mid-1943. Hedgehog employment rates increased as captains gained confidence. Success rates climbed as crews learned proper technique. By the end of 1943, Hedgehog was achieving approximately 1 kill for every 5 to 6 attacks, compared to 1 kill per 60 depth charge attacks. The improvement was dramatic, measurable, undeniable. But the real validation would come not in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific, where an American destroyer escort would demonstrate exactly what the Hedgehog could achieve in the hands of a crew that believed in it completely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. USS England, hull number DE-635, was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, one of 563 such vessels built by the United States Navy during World War II. She displaced 1,673 tons, measured 306 feet in length, could make 23 knots maximum speed. Her armament was typical for her class: 3 3-inch guns, anti-aircraft weapons, torpedo tubes, depth charge racks, and 1 Hedgehog mount installed forward of the bridge. She was commissioned on December 10, 1943, named for Ensign John Charles England, killed aboard the battleship Oklahoma during the Pearl Harbor attack. England's crew was largely composed of reservists, men who had been civilians 18 months earlier and now found themselves operating complex machinery in combat conditions. The commanding officer, Commander W. B. Pendleton, and executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton, Jr., oversaw a complement of 15 officers and 198 enlisted men. Among these men, Lieutenant John A. Williamson served as gunnery officer, responsible for all weapons systems, including the Hedgehog. From commissioning through early 1944, England's crew developed a reputation within Destroyer Escort Division 39 for what contemporaries called tautness. The ship was meticulously maintained, procedures were drilled relentlessly, weapons systems were tested and retested until crews could operate them reflexively under any conditions. This obsession with excellence was particularly focused on the Hedgehog. Unlike many destroyer escorts where the weapon served primarily as backup to conventional depth charges, England's crew treated it as their primary anti-submarine weapon. Lieutenant Williamson had studied everything available about Hedgehog tactics. He understood the mathematics, knew the successful attack patterns, had trained his gunners through hundreds of practice firings. The sonar team, led by their operators, practiced continuous tracking exercises that maintained contact through simulated submarine evasions. The engine room crew learned to maintain precise speeds regardless of sea conditions, understanding that stable velocity was critical for accurate Hedgehog employment. Every department understood their role in the system, had practiced their procedures until they could execute them while exhausted or frightened or under fire. By May 1944, England had completed escort duties between various Pacific bases, but had not yet encountered enemy submarines. The ship arrived at Espiritu Santo on March 12th, where she and two sister ships, USS George and USS Raby, formed Escort Division 39 under Commander Hamilton Haynes. These three destroyer escorts spent the following weeks conducting convoy escorts and patrol duties, valuable but unglamorous work that provided no opportunities to test their anti-submarine capabilities in combat. That changed on May 18, 1944, when Fleet Radio Unit Pacific decoded a Japanese message that transformed routine patrol into historic opportunity. Japanese submarine I-16 was carrying rice in 75-pound rubber bags for the bypassed Japanese garrison at Buin on Bougainville's southern tip. The message included enough detail that American codebreakers could predict the submarine's approximate position and course. Escort Division 39 was ordered to intercept. I-16 was a large submarine, 197 feet long, displacing 2,554 tons, surfaced. She had completed 9 war patrols, was commanded by experienced officer Lieutenant Commander Takeuchi Yoshitaka, carried a crew of 107 men. This was not a training target or an obsolete boat pressed into desperation service. This was a proven combat submarine with veteran crew, conducting a supply mission but fully capable of attacking any Allied vessel that threatened it. England gained sonar contact on I-16 during calm, sunny weather on the early afternoon of May 19th. Range, 1,500 yards. The submarine was detectable but beginning evasive maneuvers the moment it realized destroyer escorts were hunting it. Lieutenant Williamson took his position at the Hedgehog, while sonar operators called out bearing and range updates every few seconds. Commander Pendleton reduced speed to 10 knots, the optimal velocity for maintaining stable sonar contact while allowing precise maneuvering. The first Hedgehog attack at 1341 was a miss. Complete silence after the projectiles entered the water, no detonations, but sonar contact remained solid. The submarine was at 130 feet depth, moving at 4 knots on bearing 200 degrees. Williamson recalculated the spread, accounting for the submarine's course and the time delay before projectiles reached depth. England maneuvered for second approach. At 1348, Williamson fired again. 1 detonation, confirmed by multiple listeners. A hit, but not sufficient to sink a submarine of I-16's size. The submarine dove deeper, attempting to escape below the Hedgehog's effective range. Fathometer readings after the third attack showed the submarine at 325 feet, significantly deeper than the crew had estimated. This explained the miss. They had aimed for 200 feet depth, firing the spread too shallow. The submarine's desperate dive had saved it temporarily, but revealed its tactic. I-16 was going deep to escape. The fourth attack, at 1410, missed because of this miscalculation. But now Williamson understood. Submarine's depth could aim the Hedgehog spread to intercept at 300 feet rather than 200. The fifth attack at 1433 was mathematically perfect. 4 to 6 detonations echoed through the sonar, followed seconds later by a massive underwater explosion that lifted England's fantail out of the water and knocked crew members off their feet throughout the ship. The pressure hull had ruptured catastrophically. At 325 feet depth, the ocean pressure was 145 pounds per square inch. The Torpex explosions had punctured the hull in multiple locations. Water entered the pressure hull at rates measured in hundreds of gallons per second. The submarine's internal compartments flooded faster than watertight doors could be sealed. Men trapped in the forward sections drowned in darkness as seawater rose to the ceiling. The boat lost buoyancy control, began falling stern first toward the ocean floor 3,000 feet below. The pressure hull, designed for maximum depth of 350 feet, began imploding at around 400 feet. I-16 ceased to exist as a coherent structure, became spreading debris and oil slick. All 107 crew members died in less than 2 minutes. Debris began surfacing 20 minutes after the explosion. Oil spread across calm water, marking the kill. The following day, the slick measured 3 miles by 6 miles, visible evidence of complete destruction. England had achieved her first submarine kill. The crew's training, their obsessive attention to procedure, their mathematical precision, had produced exactly the result the Hedgehog was designed to deliver when employed correctly. What happened over the following 11 days would transform one successful attack into legendary achievement. American codebreakers decoded another Japanese message on May 20th, revealing plans for a submarine trap north of the Admiralty Islands. 7 submarines of the 7th Submarine Squadron, Row 104, Row 105, Row 106, Row 108, Row 109, Row 112, and Row 116 were forming a patrol line across a route Admiral Halsey had used twice before. These were Type Co coastal defense submarines, smaller than I-16 but still formidable opponents, each carrying a crew of 53 to 58 men. Admiral Soemu Toyoda had ordered this scouting line to detect American carrier movements and determine whether the next Allied offensive would target the Palau Islands or the Marianas. The submarines were stationed at designated intervals along a line extending from Truk Island toward Manus. If they detected an invasion fleet, Toyoda could commit his first mobile fleet of carriers and battleships to a decisive engagement. The entire Japanese defensive strategy in the Central Pacific depended on this submarine screen, providing early warning. Escort Division 39 was ordered to hunt them down. England, George, and Hereby formed a scouting line with 16,000-yard intervals, sweeping through the area where codebreakers predicted submarines would be stationed. On May 22nd at 0350, George gained radar contact on Row 106, surfaced in darkness. The submarine dove when located by searchlight. George attempted a Hedgehog attack at 0415 but missed. England regained sonar contact at 0425, manoeuvred for attack position, fired first salvo and missed. Second attack at 0501 scored at least 3 detonations. The large underwater explosion that followed confirmed the kill. Heavy oil slick with debris was visible after sunrise. Row 106 and her 56 crew members were gone. The following day, May 23rd, the 3 destroyer escorts detected Row 104 at 0600. Hereby and George made multiple Hedgehog attacks beginning at 0617, expending 8 salvos over 2 hours without achieving hits. England then took over the attack. First salvo missed. Second salvo at 0834 scored an estimated 10 to 12 detonations. Breaking up noises were followed by massive underwater explosion 3 minutes later. Debris and oil appeared on the surface at 10:45. Row 104 and 53 crew members were destroyed. 11 hours later, George detected row 116 on radar at 0120 on May 24th. England made sonar contact at 0150 and achieved 3 to 5 detonations on the first Hedgehog attack at 0214. Breaking up noises were not followed by the dramatic explosions that characterized previous kills, but oil and debris appeared after sunrise at 0702. The oil slick expanded over following day to cover several square miles. Row 1, 16 and 56 crew members were confirmed lost. 3 submarines in 3 days. The statistical probability of this achievement was vanishingly small, even accounting for code-breaking advantages that positioned the destroyer escorts near submarine patrol stations. Successfully prosecuting 3 attacks in rapid succession demonstrated tactical excellence that transcended luck. England's crew was executing Hedgehog attacks with precision that approached theoretical maximum effectiveness. But they were not finished. On May 26th, at 23:04, the 3 destroyer escorts encountered row 108. England gained sonar contact at 23:24 and commenced Hedgehog attack. The first salvo scored 4 to 6 detonations at 23:23. Massive explosion followed. Row 108 went down with all 53 hands, 4 submarines in 8 days. The performance was unprecedented, seemingly impossible, yet documented in action reports witnessed by 3 separate ship crews. The final kill tested both England's crew and Commander Haynes' judgment. On May 27th, the 3 destroyer escorts detected row 105. This submarine's captain, Lieutenant Junichi Inoue, was experienced and skilled. He had previously survived torpedo attacks from USS Tarpon, had launched torpedoes at American cruisers, had rescued downed Japanese aviators. Row 105 began a 25-hour battle for survival that would demonstrate exactly how difficult anti-submarine warfare remained despite improved weapons and tactics. George made the initial contact and began Hedgehog attacks. Miss. Raby joined the hunt. Miss. The submarine was conducting radical, evasive maneuvers, changing depth and course constantly, forcing the destroyer escorts to reacquire contact repeatedly. Hours passed. Salvo after salvo splashed into the water and sank without detonating. Over 20 Hedgehog attacks were launched by George and Raby combined. None achieved hits. The submarine remained alive, maneuvering desperately but successfully, demonstrating that even superior weapons required either luck or extraordinary skill to defeat a determined enemy. Commander Haynes made a decision that would become part of naval legend. He had been keeping England in reserve, perhaps believing that other ships in the division deserved opportunity to achieve kills, perhaps concerned that England's streak was simply unusual luck that could not continue. But after 20-plus failed attacks, facing a submarine that might escape if the hunt continued much longer, Haynes transmitted a message that mixed exasperation with recognition. Oh, hell. Go ahead, England. At 07:36 on May 28th, England fired Hedgehog salvo that scored 6 to 10 detonations. Major explosion followed at 07:41. Oil fountain and debris appeared on the surface. Row 105 and all 55 crew members were destroyed. 5 submarines in 10 days, 6 if you counted I-16 from the previous week. The feat was unmatched in naval history and would never be equalled during the remaining 15 months of World War II. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to England that captured the magnitude of the achievement. There'll always be an England in the United States Navy. The promise was kept. When USS England was eventually decommissioned after the war, the name was transferred to a new guided missile cruiser, ensuring the legacy continued. But the real legacy was not in the ship's name or the medals awarded to her crew. The real legacy was in what England's achievement proved about the Hedgehog and about the transformation that had occurred between February 1943, when captains were required to explain why they were not using the weapon, and May 1944, when a single destroyer escort sank 6 submarines in 12 days, specifically because her crew had mastered it. The final statistics told the story with numerical clarity. During World War II, British forces conducted 5,174 depth charge attacks, achieving 85.5 confirmed kills. This represented a ratio of approximately 60.5 attacks per kill, or roughly 1.6% success rate. The Hedgehog, by contrast, achieved 268 attacks during the war with 47 confirmed kills, a ratio of 5.7 attacks per kill, or approximately 17.5% success rate. The improvement was more than tenfold. But raw numbers understated the tactical revolution the weapon enabled. Depth charge attacks required the attacking ship to pass directly over the submarine, losing sonar contact during the critical attack phase, then waiting 15 to 20 minutes for underwater turbulence to clear before regaining contact. Hedgehog allowed continuous tracking throughout multiple attack runs, adjustments based on real-time sonar data, methodical refinement of aim until geometry and luck aligned for a kill. By mid-1944, the United States Navy was claiming 8% kill rate with single Hedgehog patterns. By mid-1945, that figure had risen to 10%. The improvement reflected both better training and the cumulative effect of institutional learning as successful techniques were documented, shared, and taught to new crews. The weapon that captains had avoided using in early 1943 had become, by war's end, the preferred anti-submarine weapon aboard vessels that carried it. The transformation from distrusted device to legendary weapon killer occurred not through technological breakthrough or miraculous engineering refinement, but through the prosaic work of teaching men how to use what they already had. The officer from the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, who arrived at Londonderry in spring 1943, whose name was never recorded in official histories, accomplished more toward winning the Battle of the Atlantic than many admirals whose names fill military textbooks. He understood what engineers and bureaucrats often miss. Technology alone accomplishes nothing. A weapon is only as effective as the human beings who employ it, and human beings require training, confidence, institutional support, successful examples to emulate, and cultural transformation that overcomes resistance to change. The Hedgehog worked in early 1943 exactly as well as it worked in mid-1944. What changed was that sailors learned how to believe in it. The legacy extended far beyond World War II. The United States Navy continued deploying Hedgehog through the Cold War, alongside newer weapons like ASROC and homing torpedoes. The Soviet Union copied the design in 1949 as the MBU-200, later developing improved versions. Commonwealth navies used Hedgehog variants into the 1980s. The British Limbo mortar, introduced just after war's end, employed the same forward-throwing principle that the Hedgehog had pioneered. Modern, anti-submarine warfare still reflects lessons learned from Hedgehog development and employment. The principle of maintaining sensor contact throughout the attack, rather than losing contact during the terminal phase, now underlies virtually all anti-submarine systems. The insight that direct hits are vastly more effective than near misses, even if direct hits require precision rather than area saturation, shapes modern weapon design. The understanding that crew training and tactical doctrine matter as much as hardware specifications influences how militaries integrate new technologies. The Hedgehog demonstrated that innovation requires more than good engineering. It requires understanding the psychology of the people who will use the innovation, addressing their legitimate concerns, providing adequate training, building institutional confidence through documented success stories, and accepting that cultural change takes time and dedicated effort. These lessons apply far beyond weapons development. Every technological revolution faces similar resistance. New medical procedures that contradict established practice, manufacturing techniques that require abandoning familiar methods, software systems that demand different workflows, business models that threaten existing relationships. The pattern repeats across industries and epochs. Good ideas fail not because they are wrong, but because nobody teaches people how to believe in them. The officer from DMWD who arrived at Londonderry understood this intuitively. He did not dismiss the sailors' concerns as ignorance or cowardice. He did not blame users for the weapon's poor performance. He recognized that resistance was rational, based on reasonable fears about untested equipment in life or death situations. He addressed those fears not through mandates or threats, but through education, demonstration, and support. He transformed skeptics into believers by showing them that the Hedgehog worked, then teaching them how to make it work consistently. Lieutenant Williamson, aboard USS England, represented the culmination of this transformation. He was not a genius or a tactical prodigy. He was a competent officer who studied his weapons thoroughly, trained his crews relentlessly, trusted in mathematics and procedure over intuition and tradition. When opportunities presented themselves in the form of Japanese submarine contacts, his crew executed exactly as they had trained, with precision that produced results matching theoretical predictions. The feat seemed miraculous only to those unfamiliar with the boring, methodical work that preceded it. The story of the Hedgehog is ultimately about the unglamorous labor that enables spectacular achievement. Training exercises that prepare crews for moments that may never come. Maintenance procedures that ensure reliability under conditions engineers never tested. Cultural change that overcomes institutional momentum. Documentation that shares success stories with crews who have not yet encountered their first enemy. All this work is invisible in the dramatic accounts of submarine kills and action reports that celebrate victories. But this work is what victory requires. The explosion that destroyed I-16, visible as oil and debris spreading across calm Pacific water, was the endpoint of a chain of causation that stretched back through years of development, months of installation, weeks of training, hours of practice, and minutes of precise execution. Every link in that chain was necessary. Remove any single element: the sonar operator's training, the gunner's practiced aim, the captain's trust in his weapons, the institutional knowledge built through documented successes, and the submarine escapes. The mathematics of anti-submarine warfare were always clear. A weapon that maintained sensor contact throughout the attack, that only detonated on direct hits, that allowed immediate follow-up attacks without acoustic interference, should achieve dramatically higher kill rates than depth charges. This was obvious in 1941 when the Hedgehog was being developed. It remained true in early 1943 when captains were avoiding the weapon. It became operationally relevant in mid-1943 when crews learned how to employ it correctly. And it produced historic results in May 1944 when a single destroyer escort demonstrated exactly what was possible. The weapon never changed. What changed was human understanding, human confidence, human capability. That is the lesson that transcends the specific technology. Innovation succeeds not through engineering brilliance alone, but through the patient work of teaching people how to believe in what is possible. The Hedgehog killed 47 U-boats during World War II, but its greater achievement was demonstrating that the distance between a good idea and effective implementation is measured not in technical specifications, but in human transformation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.